shock you, and we'll grin in your face.
On May 25th, 2020, Mr. George Floyd died while in the sole care, custody, and control of those who have been asserted as the Minnesota law enforcement. So far, only one person was initially charged and detained for this homicide. Now, on the 3rd of June, which would be today, there was an announcement made by the Attorney General that 3 additional officers would be facing related charges. A question is, why are only 4 officers being charged versus the 5 officers that appear to be present at the crime scene?
It happened so quick and they're so quick.
This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We are going to be addressing this dynamic whereby there were 5 officers apparently involved on the day of the death of George Floyd. However, only 4 officers are being held accountable at this time. The situation has been highly politicized, and what happens in these situations is that often the individuals who are the direct victims of these types of crimes, they get forgotten in these situations. And so it's important to remember that while society is seeking justice, that justice also needs to be focused on those who have been personally impacted by this harm. And so we are going to talk about why it is so important to make sure that all of the individuals who were involved in this situation are held accountable in this particular matter. The death of George Floyd has been identified by medical examiners as a homicide. And homicide is the killing of one person by another person. And it can be lawful or unlawful. And then when it's criminal homicide, it's going to be divided into murder and manslaughter. This is the top portion of the medical examiner report. We're going to look at subsequent portions so that you can see how the medical examiner came to the determination that this death was a homicide. This is the second portion of the medical examiner report. Now, there are a few concerns related to this report, specifically related to time of death and location of death. And this is very important, by the way. We will address those in subsequent discussions, however. Wording is very important in a medical examiner report, and this particular report contains a few oddities, and those oddities can be very important when you're talking about a case such as this. And so the medical examiner has identified cause of death as cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual restraint and neck compression. Now, the way this is written, it's suggesting that it is the cardiopulmonary arrest that complicated the actual process of the law enforcement action of subdual restraint and neck compression. So then you have manner of death is homicide, and the medical examiner indicates that the injury occurred based upon the decedent, which would be the person who passed, the decedent experiencing a cardiopulmonary arrest while being restrained by law enforcement officers. The medical examiner also identifies underlying heart disease and also finding substances in the decedent's system.
We'll mock you and shock you, and we'll grin in your face.
Here you see 4 officers identified as participating in this homicide. However, there is an additional officer who has been identified based upon a video that was reportedly provided by the Minneapolis Park Police Department. In this video footage, you have what appears to be 4 officers involved in this homicide. You have 3 officers who are on top of Mr. Floyd, with one having his shin, knee area in the neck area of Mr. Floyd and pressing down repeatedly. It's unclear what the other two officers were doing exactly during this entire time period because the view of them has been significantly obstructed, and so it's not always clear exactly what they are doing. You do hear some video footage that includes voices, but aside from that, right now with what has been provided, we have limited information about what they were doing and the extent to which their behavior actually facilitated this cardiopulmonary arrest. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that you don't really know right now exactly what role each person played in bringing on or facilitating or exacerbating this medical distress that George Floyd experienced. Then you have another individual who is to the left, and that individual appeared to be someone who was serving as a lookout and also a consultant to the other three. They do appear to be communicating pretty frequently during this entire time period. It's also important to mention that because you don't really know exactly what took place in terms of what was going on with George Floyd's body, it's important not to try to focus on simply one officer in terms of the impact that particular officer had on Mr. Floyd's body, because it's not clear what the other officers were doing. It's not clear how their behavior impacted this entire situation. So you want to think about them as being what's known as jointly and severally liable. So they were all involved in this, not just the one who had his knee in George Floyd's neck. Because if you focus on only this knee in the neck issue, then it alleviates the other two from being as culpable. And because you don't know exactly what took place, it's actually possible that something that one of the other two might have done might have actually been more detrimental than what the other one was doing with the knee in the neck. And so it's important to think about what they were doing as one collective dynamic. While there is a focus on the four who were involved in the previous depiction, there were 5 individuals involved at that crime scene. And so you have 5 individuals who are on the screen, and you can see Derek Chauvin in one picture, and then you see the other 4 individuals involved off to the right-hand side. Now, one individual is the individual with the bandana looking face cover, and then you have the other individual with the blue face cover, and then you have the 2 individuals, one at the bottom and one off to the side without a face cover. But all 5 of these individuals were present at this particular crime scene. While this 5th officer was significantly involved in the arrest process and was apparently present before, during, and after the homicide, there has been no public consideration of that person's role, and there has been no public discussion of charges related to this person's participation in this entire situation. And as you can see here from this video footage, that the 5th individual is significantly involved with the arrest process and also significantly involved with the process that led to the homicide on the other side of the street. If the Attorney General, however, is going to do complete justice in this case, the Attorney General needs to consider the roles of all of the officers involved. All of the officers have a duty to serve and protect and to not do harm. And so this needs to be considered in terms of considering all of the officers and the roles of all of the officers in facilitating the dynamic that took place that led to the death of Mr. Floyd. This situation has not only been highly politicized, it's been highly racialized. And because it's been so racialized, it has made it very difficult to get to the truth and get to justice in an expedient manner. There has been so much focus on this racial dynamic that the focus has been on the one individual who presents as quote unquote white, and less focus and attention given to the other individuals who present, at least 3 of them, presenting as racially ambiguous. And those would be the 3 in the depictions on the screen. And so then you also have a 4th individual who presents as Asian. And so again, you have this racial ambiguity dynamic going on when there is this highly racialized overarching theme to this situation. And so this racial ambiguity and the having also these individuals who would be identified as brown participating in this homicide, it changes the standard narrative that is out there. And so some of the lack of attention to these individuals or the obscuring of the roles of these individuals may be tied to that. But when you are talking about acquiring justice, you need to consider all of the factors. And just because something does not fit with a narrative does not mean that it should not be considered. And so you have all 5 of these individuals involved, and all 5 of these individuals need to be considered in terms of the roles that they played in bringing about the death of Mr. George Floyd.
Thousands were watching, no one saw a thing.
If the state of Minnesota is seeking to do complete justice, it must do it by the whole. That means that the Minnesota 5 need to be held accountable, not just the Minnesota 4.